Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Maggie Blake. I am a consultant with NALCAB and Civitas. Our agenda here shows a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start by going through kind of some preparations for closeout, and then I'll pass it over to my teammate Grace, who will go through some specifics of the documents needed for closeout. And then lastly, Eric will talk a little bit about what happens after closeout. Next slide. And one more. So before you can close out your CDBG-CV grant, there are a few things you'll need to think about to determine that you are ready for grant closeout. The first and most obvious is to confirm that all CDBG-CV funds have been expended and that all funded activities are eligible and that they met a national objective and that all activities are complete in IDIS. You'll also want to verify that there are no open audits related to CV funds. So any open audit or monitoring findings related to CDBG-CV grant funds need to be corrected before the grant can be closed out. I will definitely be looking at these to verify that corrections have made before they will continue with the closeout process. And if any CV funded activities have generated any program income, you'll want to verify that that program income was receipted and treated as annual formula CDBG program income, and just make sure that you have appropriately documented any program income related to CDBG-CV funds. And lastly, you'll want to verify that all PR29 reports have been submitted during the period of performance of your CV grant, and that those have been completed and submitted in IDIS. And I'll touch on those in just a moment. If the answer is no to any of the questions here, you may not be ready to close out your CDBG-CV grant, but hopefully these questions can be kind of a guide to get yourself ready. And if the answer is yes to all of it, then you're ready to proceed with closeout. Next slide. The PR29 reports are also known as the quarterly cash on hand report. So this is a report that's submitted quarterly, obviously, and it's submitted to HUD in IDIS. And these reports replace the quarterly SF425 report. And in this screenshot here on the slide, you'll see an example of a PR29. This report documents the cash on hand for the reporting period. You'll see that the report shows both regular CDBG funds and CDBG-CV funds. CV funds are in the column on the far right. This grantee in this example in the screenshot here does strict reimbursement. So therefore the amount of CV funds drawn are equal to the amount dispersed, and the report is showing 0 cash on hand. So again, to prepare for closeout, you'll want to go back in IDIS and make sure that all PR29s have been submitted during the period of performance for your CV grant. And those reports can be found in IDIS in the reports module. Next slide. We will also need to submit a sort of final report to HUD. HUD's CDBG closeout guidance notice references this final report and needs to be submitted for CV grants in order to close out. However, HUD has not released any additional guidance on reporting requirements for CV funds. And so current guidance says that grantees should report on CV accomplishments in the annual paper. Over the last few years, grantees should have been reporting annual accomplishments for CV funds in each annual paper. And at the moment, that is the continued guidance. That final report should be submitted in your normal annual paper. Next slide. And then the last report to prepare for closeout is the financial summary report. For entitlement grantees, this would be the PR26 financial summary report. And for states, this would be the PR28 grant financial summary report. Both can be found in the reports module in IDIS. These reports document a few important requirements. So first, they'll show the percentage of CDBG-CV funds that primarily benefited LMI persons. As a reminder, the requirement is that 70% of CV funds, excluding planning and admin funds, need to benefit LMI persons. With regular CDBG grants, this is usually an easy benchmark to hit, but we wanted to flag it for you because of the pandemic. There might have been more activities that met the urgent need national objective. So that might skew that 70% benchmark requirement. The financial summary report will help you verify that you're meeting that 70% threshold. Additionally, the financial summary report will verify that grantees are meeting the 20% planning and admin cap. And also, we just wanted to flag as a reminder that the 15% public service cap was waived for CDBG-CV funds through the CARES Act, so that requirement does not apply here. And then lastly on this slide, you'll see a list of some additional reports that are used to help prepare the financial summary reports. PR05 and the PR07 report on drawdowns by project activity and voucher numbers. And then the PR26 activity summary by selected grant shows the breakdown of the funding of activities that are funded with CV funds. So you can hold a report just to show that CV grant, and it'll list for you each activity that was funded with CV funds, funded amount, drawn amount, and then the percentages of the grant that were spent on those activities. We will pause here briefly to answer any questions.
We've received a couple of questions in the Q&A feature. Those have been answered for those of you that might want to see those questions. I'll go through them real quick, Maggie. The first is, what does closeout mean? This is simply the completion process. Remember, and Grace will go over, you do have 6 years to fully expend your CDBG-CV funds. However, you need not wait 6 years. If you have expended all your funds, as Maggie has described, you may be ready to go ahead and officially close out the CV grant with HUD. So this is essentially the completion process and final reporting. A second question, what if we'll be ready to close out before HUD releases any additional requirements on reporting? At this time, we expect that the final reporting will continue to be part of the annual CAPER or performance report for states, but you'll work directly with your field office and your assigned HUD rep to officially close out, at which point your rep can determine if your final CAPER or performance report meets the CV closeout requirements. Maggie, could you go back over the 70% low to moderate income benchmark, please?
Yes, absolutely. So of your CDBG-CV grant, 70% of that grant, with excluding your planning and admin funding, should be spent to benefit primarily LMI individuals. So that could be any of the LMI national objectives. And you can find the percentage in those financial summary reports that are listed here. So if you're an entitlement grantee, you'll find that in the PR26 financial summary report. And then if you are a state, in the PR28.
Thank you. There is another question about the expenditure deadline. Grace will cover that momentarily. There's a question from Alyssa James. If your remaining CV funds are used on public service, the usual 15% cap would not apply, correct? As a point of clarification here, we are discussing CDBG-CV closeout specifically. So all of these funds must be used to prepare, prevent, or respond to the impacts of COVID-19. And so therefore, yes, or I'm perhaps the 15% public service cap does not apply to CDBG-CV funds, but you must continue to make a connection tieback PPR for use of all CDBG-CV funds. Maggie, could you go back to the slide on the PR29 and make sure that everyone is clear on the cash on hand report, what we need to see here before we close out?
Yes, so you're going to want to look back at all PR29 reports submitted in IDIS. These should have been submitted on a quarterly basis in IDIS that are showing each quarter the amount of cash on hand that the grantee has. So as a grantee, you should be looking back for all quarters during the period of performance of your CV grant to verify that those reports were submitted. Eric, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's good. Thank you, Maggie. There is a follow-up question on the PR29 requesting or clarification that someone has been submitting quarterly SF425s. All CDBG-CV grantees should have been drawing funds down through IDIS. And so we're speaking directly to entitlement cities, counties, and state grantees, so not subrecipients. Again, this webinar is specific to grant closeout with HUD. So this is geared for cities, counties, and states that have received these grants. All of those jurisdictions would therefore have IDIS access and should have been reporting using 420 or the PR29s instead of the 425s. Since the end of 2019, this has been a requirement. So this is for direct grantees. There seems to be quite a bit of questions on the PR29. I think Maggie's addressed that. However, I will direct you for those of you that needed specific instructions on how to complete the PR29. Grace can go over a little bit, but we'll also direct you to the HUD exchange where there is additional guidance on the PR29s. And I believe that that answers all of the current questions on the PR29.
Great, so I'll pass it over to Grace.
Thank you, Maggie. So once you have reviewed all of these reports and these items and determined that your CDBG-CV grant is ready for closeout, you will move on to completing the required grant closeout documents. So here are a list of the required documents for entitlements and states. You'll see just a little bit of variation. The entitlements will submit the closeout agreement, the HUD form 7082 if that's applicable, and I will explain that a little bit further later. And you see here the SF425 is listed in this list for closeout, not to get confused with the SF425s that were replaced by the PR29 report. But to close out your CDBG-CV grant, you will submit the SF425 if you are an entitlement grantee. States, on the other hand, do not submit that form, but they do submit the closeout agreement, HUD form 7082 if applicable again, and their final PER, including the PR28s. So first, with the grant closeout agreement, this is a standard HUD form. States will use HUD form 40152. Entitlements will use HUD form 40158. There's just a little bit of variation in these forms. If you pull up the form for entitlements, you may notice that there is some reference to the CDBG recovery program. You can ignore those references. HUD is still in the process of working through the grant closeout for CDBG, and the forms have not been updated yet. So again, if you see an expiration date on the form, you can ignore that expiration date for now, but be on the lookout for updated forms as HUD moves through this. The grant closeout agreement is pretty simple, but there are some items that you will need to complete the agreement that you can find in IDIS. So when you log into IDIS, you will go over to the grants module at the top. And if you search your CDBG grants, you'll see a list of all of your grants. Here we have the grant number circled, and the easiest way to find the CDBG-CV grant number is by looking at those two initials in the middle of the grant number. Here you can see it's B20MW 120044. This is the CV grant, and with regular CDBG funds, this grant number is going to have MC in the middle. So again, when you're looking for your CDBG-CV grant in a list, always look for that grant number that has two different initials in the middle of the grant number. The other important item that you will need that you can find on this page is the obligation date. You can see in this sample over on the right-hand side, there's an obligation date of July 30th, 2020. This is important to note. This varies for each grantee based on the date that the grant agreement was signed. So when we're talking about expenditure deadlines, this is based on each grantee's obligation date. So there's not a start date that everybody uses. You'll have to look and see what your obligation date is. So once you have completed that, you can move on to the HUD 082 form if applicable. At this point, this form should not be applicable for grantees that are ready to close out. This form is only used if there are funds remaining in the grant and funds that HUD will need to be recapturing, and that will be indicated in box 11C. While we're on this topic, just a reminder, the threshold to expend 80% of the grant within 3 years has been removed completely. So there is no longer a requirement to expend 80% of the funds within 3 years. So now we're looking at the 6-year expenditure deadline to expend the funds. And again, you'll look back at that obligation date in IDIS to see the 6 years from that date. And then moving on to the SF 425 that will need to be completed for grant closeout. I think many grantees are familiar with this form. There's just some specific information per grantee, but there are a few items I did want to point out in 6, 7, 8, and 9. The report type is obviously going to be the final report. And then in number 7, basis of accounting, you will see there is accrual and cash basis. The accrual basis is the accounting method in which expenses are recorded as they are incurred. And then cash basis is recording expenses after they are paid. So if you are doing reimbursement, you are using the cash basis accounting. And then number 8, we have the project and grant period. This is the grant period of performance. So again, back to that obligation date, that's going to be the date that you put in the from box. And then the grant period end date is going to be the end of the program year in which you report on the final CAPER. So it's going to depend on the program year in which you expend all of the funds. And then number 9 is going to be that same reporting period end date. So once you have completed all of those forms, you will be ready to submit the required documents to your CPD field office. Once you submit your required forms to your field office, they will review the following items. They will look at that financial summary back to the items that Maggie was reviewing. They'll make sure that each grantee is in compliance with those items. We'll review the line of credit to determine that all funds have been spent. And then we'll also look at any audit reports and monitoring letters. We'll review files to determine if there are any unresolved findings and make sure those are addressed. And then finally, once your field office has gone through this process and they determine that the grant is ready for closeout, they will execute the closeout agreement. And we are going to stop here again for any questions related to the grant closeout documents.
Thank you, Grace. Again, we've had some follow-up questions on the PR 29 For most of you, we put a link directly in our response to you in the Q&A feature in the right-hand panel. So you want to check that link we provided to the HUD Exchange where those instructions can be found. Most recently, there was a question about the 15% public service cap remaining in place until the CDBG-CV expenditures deadline. So the 15% public service cap does not apply to the CDBG-CV grant at all. However, all CDBG-CV funds must have a tieback to prepare, prevent, or respond to COVID-19. Again, the 15% cap never applied to the CV funds, but all CV funds must have appropriate PPR tieback. So that remains in effect. Those requirements remain in effect throughout the 6-year expenditure deadline, and therefore for the life of this grant, rather than just during the actual pandemic. Again, want to remind everyone that the entire presentation, both the slides, a recording, and a transcript will be posted to the HUD Exchange following this session. Question: end date was the date CAPER is due in the program year. Not sure I'm following that, but for all grantees, your CAPER is always due 90 days after the completion of your program year. Each grantee may have different program year start and end dates, but it's always 90 days after the program year ends, and therefore the CAPER reporting on the final expenditure of the CDBG-CV funds would be due along with that annual report 90 days after the completion of the program year in which you spent the last of your CDBG-CV funds. Grace, could you go back to the screenshot of the SF 425 and go over question number 9?
Yes, so we have the SF 425 pulled back up here. There is the project and grant period, and then reporting period end date. So that end date is the end of the final program year where you are reporting on CDBG-CV funds in the CAPER. So it's not actually the date you're submitting the CAPER, but the end of that program year for the reporting period. And I think I also saw a question on number 7, the basis of accounting. Cash basis is recording the expenses after they are paid, and then accrual is recording the expenses as they are incurred.
Thank you, Grace. One more question about if we're anticipating program income, are we unable to close out? No, all program income generated by the CDBG-CV funds should actually be recorded as annual entitlement CDBG and utilized as annual CDBG, if you will, or regular CDBG program income. So those rules apply. So therefore, if you're anticipating program income or repayments from various programs assisted with CV, you'll still close out upon final expenditure of your CDBG-CV grant, and then we'll report program income as long as necessary as regular or annual program income. There's a good question here from Donna. We received 3 tranches of funds. Will closeout cover all tranches, and will we use the first obligation date from the first grant? That is correct. Even though HUD released these funds in multiple rounds or tranches, it is still one grant. If you received 3 tranches, you may be referring to funding you received from your state as a subgrantee. I don't believe any jurisdictions received 3 tranches from HUD directly, but you may want to review that with your HUD rep So we're specifically talking about the funding that you were provided directly from HUD. Again, there were 2 waves of those funds, or 2 tranches. The original obligation date for that first tranche started your 6-year period. And yes, the closeout is for the expenditure for all of those funds. There's a question from Rachel. Where can the current closeout agreement document for CV grants be found? The grant agreement and closeout agreement will be provided to you from your HUD rep directly.
And there is another question on HUD form 7082. The question is, this form is the funding approval agreement. I thought the speaker stated that to use this form only if there are remaining funds to be recaptured by HUD. This guidance is in notice CPD-22-14. This provides guidance on the forms that you will submit during grant closeout.
So we submit the CV closeout documents when we submit the CAPER. No, you will work directly with your rep. Once you have submitted that final CAPER, you'll notify your rep that you are preparing for closeout and provide those documents directly to your rep. Question from Kelly, is there a CPD notice that mentions the expenditure deadline being 6 years from obligation date? Yes, that's the CDBG-CV notice. That can be found on the HUD Exchange. We can provide a link, and I believe that's actually a link at the final slide. I believe the questions on the 425 have been answered. I'm just working through the last of the questions here, Grace, one moment. And Grace, can you please add the CPD notice number that you just referenced in the chat?
Yes, I will drop a link to the notice.
And there's one more question, perhaps Landon from HUD, you could provide some clarification on the PR-29 requirements for state grantees. Are there different requirements for the states?
I believe that the differences are very minimal. More or less, some of the guidelines they'll still be following are based on the entitlements as well.
Thank you, sir.
Mm-hmm.
A question from Carlo, when will HUD distribute the specific closeout materials? They are available. We are going over those live in this presentation, so there are no additional materials that HUD will be distributing. You will initiate closeout with your HUD rep by notifying them that you have fully drawn your grant and you have confirmed all of the reporting is completed, the PR-29s, the final CAPER, etc., as we've gone through here. I think that answers all of the open questions. So let's refer to the post closeout. Next slide, please. So most of you are probably already triggering through your annual funds, a single audit from your external auditor. However, some of the smaller CDBG entitlement communities may be triggering for the first time a single audit. A reminder that single audits are triggered when you utilize $750,000 or more in a fiscal year from federal funding. You can read more about the single audit requirements in 2 CFR 200 subpart F. Just want to bring this to your attention. You may also have provided funding to subrecipients, or in the case of state, subgrantees that are triggering this for the first time. So want to call your attention and remind you of single audit requirements. HUD will, of course, be monitoring the use of CDBG-CV funds post-closeout if they have not already begun reviewing some of your activities. We would like to encourage you to, or provide emphasis, if you will, on economic development activities and public services. As I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that your tieback for prepare, prevent, or respond to COVID is made very clear. HUD reps are often doing remote monitoring these days and are not able to necessarily have conversations about every individual activity that they might be monitoring remotely. So we would encourage you to provide a memo to the file or some sort of documentation that explains the PPR tieback that your jurisdiction has made for each activity. Include that in the activity files for when HUD reviews. On the economic development side, I encourage everyone to be very familiar with the particular waivers and modifications to economic development activities that were specifically cited in the CDBG-CV federal notice. There were some pretty substantial changes to the normal requirements for economic development activities. Many jurisdictions undertook economic development activities in the form of business assistance programs for the first time under CDBG-CV. In many cases, these programs were unveiled without full due diligence and proper policies and procedures set up from the beginning. So if you've done a business assistance program, it was your first time doing so, we really encourage you to look at basically CDBG chapter on economic development, as well as the CDBG-CV notice for waivers on economic development. Make sure you have the proper documentation for all of those activities. Hopefully you're familiar now with the term duplication of benefits and have had policies and procedures in place to avoid duplication of benefits, both at the activity level and at the beneficiary level. But this was a new requirement for many of us in the CDBG-CV notice. So please make sure you had proper policies and procedures and you documented your efforts to avoid duplication of benefits, again, at the activity and the beneficiary level. HUD will be utilizing CPD monitoring exhibit 36-1, which is simply an addendum for specific CV funds, as well as use of FY19 and FY20 annual CDBG funds for public service cap waivers. Your records retention requirement remains 4 years after grant closeout. So when your process here is complete with all the documentation and you receive your grant closeout agreement with HUD, that agreement will identify the closeout date, which will trigger your 4-year completion, or your your 4-year record retention requirement. Want to make sure that you have collected all of the necessary files from any contractors or vendors, and your subrecipients are maintaining compliance with this records retention as well. Final note for long-term is the real property or equipment acquired or improved with CDBG-CV funds. They remain subject to program requirements. You may be familiar with our intended use period. The intended use period is a minimum of 5 years. And so you want to make sure that the real property or equipment acquired or improved with CDBG-CV funds is tracked for compliance through, at minimum, that 5-year intended use period. Next slide, please. So once these materials are shared, we have provided some links here for you that you'll be able to access, but you can take a quick screenshot here if you like. The HUD Exchange, specifically the CDBG-CV page, has all of the original notice, the FAQs, It will have closeout guidance, these documents that we provided here. All the previous webinars and conferences and problem-solving clinics are all up there on the HUD Exchange as well. The CPD notices that we referenced are linked here as well. And you can see those, they're also published on HUD.gov and are always updated on that website. Next slide. If you require additional assistance, HUD, of course, has this ongoing virtual conference this week, but there are also, you have an ability for problem-solving clinics, which are one-on-one TA appointments. These are being hosted each month through October. The next clinic is on June 15th, and you can register for specific one-on-one TA, again, virtually through the HUD Exchange. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll go through some of the remaining open questions here and then open it for any additional questions. Michelle's posting, still confused on submission dates. Our first CV is almost ready for closeout. However, our second round will not be completed anytime soon. So again, while HUD released the funds in multiple tranches, each grantee actually only has one grant, one CDBG-CV grant from HUD. If you look in IDIS, you only have one grant number, and your grant agreement was simply updated each time you received additional funds. There were only 2 tranches to my knowledge. Landon could correct me if I'm wrong. So those of you that might have received additional tranches, you may have been a sub-grantee from your state, if that is applicable. So I believe everyone received CDBG-CV1 and CDBG-CV2. Those are the only releases. Question about clarification on the duplication of benefits at the activity and the beneficiary level. So for example, a lot of organizations did rent, utility, and mortgage assistance for those impacted by COVID-19. So at the activity level, you want to make sure that your organizations that you might have contracted or selected as subrecipients, that they did not receive additional funding to run the same programs for the same beneficiaries. And then at the beneficiary level, you want to make sure that those clients, those tenants that received funding also did not have duplication of benefits. So your subrecipients can't have been compensated for the program multiple times. So from your organization and maybe from the state or your county or some other entity, as well as your individual clients. So you want to make sure that if you provided rental assistance for 3 to 6 months for a particular tenant through CDBG-CV from your organization, that they didn't also receive it from the Treasury ERAP program or from a local foundation or state ESG programs, for example. This question about the records retention. The CDBG-CV notice specifically requires the 4-year records retention for CDBG-CV. This question about the possibility that unspent CDBG-CV funds will be recaptured if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling. We are not able to speak to that about what Congress may or may not do. There's a lot of follow-up questions on the duplication of benefits. At this point, I will direct you to the HUD Exchange for CDBG-CV. There is information there, ample information about duplication of benefits, defining duplication of benefits, and best practices for reviewing duplication of benefits. You want to make sure at a minimum, if you had subrecipients, that you had policies and procedures in place at the beginning, and that you have monitored your subrecipients for their compliance and their policies and procedures for documenting their review of duplication of benefits. There's a question, now that the expenditure deadline was extended for CDBG-CV, will the exhibit be updated? The 80% expenditure benchmark was waived. However, the 6-year expenditure deadline for all CDBG-CV funds remains in place. Follow-up question on the PR-29 reports. If they have not been submitted in IDIS, you will need to submit them correctly for each quarter going back before closeout. So yes, you will need to do so in IDIS and make sure that they have all been submitted correctly. We provided links in the answered questions for those instructions, and you can find those on the HUD Exchange. Still a few more questions about duplication of benefits. So duplication of benefits is not an issue if you provided funds and other organizations, the state or other grant programs also provided funds for the same program. What you want to make sure is that there were not duplicate payments for the same expenditures. And that would apply to your subrecipients, but specifically to, in the case example I gave of rent, mortgage, and utilities, that you're making sure that there were no duplicate payments to landlords or utility providers, etc. From CDBG-CV and other sources. I'm just trying to go through the questions here. Sean, do we have any questions in the chat? I'm going through the ones submitted in Q&A.
Not that I'm seeing right now.
So Landon provided a clarification for those of you that are with state jurisdictions. There were 3 tranches, CDBG-CV 1, 2, and 3. Again, however, there's still just one grant. There were not multiple grants to your jurisdiction. So if you have not expended all of those funds, then you're not ready for CV closeout. Local jurisdictions only receive 2 tranches typically. Question back about the 70% low to moderate income requirement. This is not a new requirement. This has been applicable to your annual funds. It's part of the PR-26 report that you submit each year with your performance report or your CAPER. So the 70% expenditure for LMI applies only to activity spending. It does not apply to admin funding or expenditures. I encourage you to run the PR-26 financial summary report for CDBG-CV funds in IDIS and take a look at that if you have not been following that as you go along the last several years. Grace, could you go back to the slide that Maggie showed where you can find the CDBG-CV grant number? So for those of you that have access to IDIS, you can search the grant module and you can find that there is a slight difference in the grant number from your annual funds. They were all 2020 grants. So you should see a B-20 and then most CV grants had the initial MW. And so should stand out in IDIS from your annual funds. But yes, they are different grant and different grant number slightly from your annual funds. Question about particular activities. I would encourage you to work with your HUD reps directly about the eligibility of activities and appropriate PPR or tiebacks at this point moving forward. We're going to share with you momentarily some information about additional sessions this week in the CV virtual conference, where they'll be discussing additional tiebacks. I would encourage you again, for those of you trying to make those PPR tiebacks at this point, to look on the HUD Exchange for the PPR tieback flexibilities guide, and you will find some examples and connections there. Questions about HUD's monitoring? Yes, HUD will likely begin monitoring, if they have not already. Your local field office and reps will be monitoring CDBG-CV. As with all monitoring, the type of monitoring and the level of monitoring is based on HUD's risk assessment of each particular grantee. And yes, it is likely that HUD will continue to monitor after closeout for compliance. Again, back to the PR29, this seems to be new information to a lot of folks. If we could just go back real quick to the slide on the PR29, this has been a requirement since 2019 for quarterly submissions of the PR29 for your annual funds. And you can see in this screenshot, this is in the grant module of IDIS, where these quarterly PR29s, cash on hand reports, as they're often referred to. You can see a screenshot where there's a column for CDBG-CV has been added. Okay, and I think that is drawing us close to our time here. We've got a few more questions from anonymous attendees. We'll try to review those and type direct questions there.